Yeah, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and quite flattering for me to be invited for a Hero of Science lecture at the Max Planck Institute. On my title slide, you can already see my background in astrophysics. And it's like a journey that is laid out here with the topics, a journey across the flat Earth. I want to start with some basics, including basic information about climate change, just to know what the scientific background of all this is. And I want to start with Alexander von Humboldt, who was one of the first, maybe the first, to write in 1843 that humans are changing the climate, quote, by cutting down forests and by releasing large amounts of steam and gas at the centers of industry. Recently, I gave a talk together with an Alexander von Humboldt expert, and he said, yes, Humboldt did know about the greenhouse effect, which was first described by Fourier in 1824. And we don't quite know what Humboldt meant with steam, whether at that time he was, like we do today, taking it to be a water vapor or not. But basically, this quote is very correct, and Humboldt, like in many subjects, was ahead of his time there. Now, make a big jump forward to 1896, when the Swedish later Nobel laureate Svante Arrhenius was the first one to try and calculate the climate sensitivity. That is, how much global warming do you expect from a doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere? He redid this calculation about 10 years later in an improved way, and then he arrived at a climate sensitivity of 4 degrees Celsius for a CO2 doubling. This value is a little bit high. Today we think it's around 3 degrees, but we still have an uncertainty range between 2 and 4 degrees for this critical parameter, which basically tells us how strongly the Earth will respond to an increase in carbon dioxide, or more generally in radiative forcing, as we call it. Of course, we all know that the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are increasing dramatically. This is 100% due to human activities. The most important of these gases is carbon dioxide in terms of the radiative forcing, so the change in the Earth's radiation balance. And just the increase in CO2 concentration by 50%, which we have already caused, increases the amount of heat available to heat the climate system by 2 watts per square meter of Earth's surface, day and night, round the clock. So that is the reason why it's getting warmer, because we're adding energy to the system. It is elementary physics, basically. The Earth, that is something that Fourier recognized in 1824, by the way, when he looked at the heat budget of planets. The planets heat up to the point where they radiate enough long-wave radiation back into space to balance what is coming in from the sun. The warmer a physical body is, the more long-wave it radiates, and this balance simply arises and sets the temperature of any planet, including planet Earth. We can see this concentration of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere back to nearly 1 million years now, from the ice cores in Antarctica, where you have ice that is so old, the deeper you drill, the older it is, and it contains air bubbles where we have samples of the ancient air, which can be analyzed for greenhouse gas content. And from that, we know that the CO2 concentration now is much higher than at least in 1 million years. Probably you have to go back more than 15 million years to find similarly high CO2 levels as we have today. The consequence of those additional 2 watts per square meter heating from the CO2 alone are seen here. This is the famous warming stripes, one way to show the global average temperature. Every stripe is 1 year. It starts in 1880 on the left and goes up to last year. The conventional way to show the same data is as a data curve like this, which now also has the advantage that it has a scale on the left where you see that we're now at 1.2 degrees above the late 19th century temperature. And that is highly relevant if you consider that in the Paris Agreement, all nations agreed to pursue efforts to limit that warming to 1.5. So we are actually now already at 1.2, heading for 1.3. We have a very, very small margin still to stop global warming. I will come back to this at the end of my talk. Now, this warming was actually predicted before it was observed. And the first official government report about global warming resulting from fossil fuel use was published in 1965, ordered by the then US President Lyndon B. Johnson. It's a famous Revell report, which basically already contains the key information that fossil fuel use will increase the global temperature. It will start melting continental ice sheets, it will increase the sea level, and so on. Now, a couple of decades later, in 1988, the famous NASA climate scientist Jim Hansen was the first to proclaim in a Senate hearing in the US that global warming is here now. The global warming that we have long predicted can now be seen in the observational data. They are outside the natural range of variability. And this made the cover of the New York Times. And I can remember this day quite well because I was a PhD student at the time in New Zealand. And of course, this was debated in the community that Jim Hansen had said that. And there were some more conservative professors saying, well, maybe it's a little bit early. Maybe it could still be within natural variability. Now, of course, nobody believes that anymore because it's clear that the temperature increase has been proceeding for decades now exactly as predicted by climate scientists already in the 70s and 80s. I'll get back to that point later on as well. And in 1990, the first IPCC report appeared. In 1992, there was the Rio Earth Summit where the Framework Convention on Climate Change was agreed to by all nations with the goal to prevent a dangerous global warming. And that was 92. We know how successful or not this has been, this pledge, if you look at the further evolution of global temperature. I mentioned the fact that the Earth's energy balance determines the global temperature, and this energy balance is very well understood because it's not a theory. We have a global radiation measurement network. We have satellite missions which measure the incoming and outgoing radiation at the top of the atmosphere. And so we know, for example, that the bottom left there, about 160 watts per square meter are absorbed, solar radiation are absorbed at the Earth's surface. The Earth then, as I mentioned, tries to re-radiate that back into space in order to get rid of that energy that's coming in every day. If we didn't get rid of it, we would overheat within hours, basically. Just think how quickly it gets warmer when the sun rises in the morning. So we have to constantly get rid of these 160 watts. But we're actually radiating here at almost 400 watts per square meter in long wave because only a tiny fraction gets through directly. Most of it comes back in terms of this back radiation, which is the greenhouse effect. And if you look at this, 342 watts per square meter absorbed back radiation. This is more than twice the solar radiation we absorb at the surface. So this greenhouse effect is no small thing. It's if you try to change the global temperature, it's the biggest knob you can turn, basically, and we have turned up that knob. So sometimes I give talks where the organizers like to have polls from the audience with their mobile phones. You can answer quiz questions or so. And if you ask people what they think, how much of the modern global warming is caused by human activities, a majority still reliably gets this wrong. Only a minority knows that it's actually 100%. probably even slightly more, because of course there are these uncertainty ranges. So within uncertainty, the observed warming agrees to the computed anthropogenic warming that we can calculate from that energy balance. But you can also look at the natural factors that could potentially cause warming, like solar activity or orbital cycles or volcanism. And because solar activity has been declining in the last 70 years or so, it has slightly counteracted human-caused warming, and there are no other reasons why the planet should warm. And so we can say that probably humans have caused slightly more than 100% of the observed warming, and it would have been slightly more if solar activity hadn't declined. I'll come back to solar activity also in a few minutes. A final point here, if we look at the Earth history, we can also now reconstruct global average temperature going back to the last ice age from the decades of paleoclimate research done with sediment cores and ice cores taken around the globe in many places. And this clearly shows, first of all, the transition here from the last ice age, which is down here, about 7 degrees warming into the Holocene. Then we have, at the beginning of the Holocene, Homo sapiens invented agriculture and started to settle down and build cities. And since then, we have benefited from a very stable climate, which we have now left behind. We are already now outside the range of Holocene climate variability, and you have to go back about 120,000 years to the Eemian interglacial before the last ice age to encounter climates that are similarly warm or even slightly warmer. So we are catapulting ourselves out of the Holocene at a pretty great speed, because the warming out of the ice age was about 1 degree per 1,000 years. Now we've seen more than 1 degree in the last 100 years, and we are now at about 0 degrees per decade, so 20 times faster than the transition from the last ice age, which hopefully you all know is due to orbital cycles. I learned that in school in the 1970s, because it actually was already clarified by Milankovitch in the 1920s what the cause of the ice age cycles is. If we zoom into that for the last 2,000 years since the birth of Christ, this again just illustrates how at a breakneck speed this modern warming is, which of course creates a problem in itself. We're not only outside the Holocene climate, where all our the nature we have around us and the agriculture is adapted to, but we're also changing at such a huge speed that adapting is becoming very, very difficult. With that curve, I'm coming to the public debate, and I want to start with the so-called hockey stick war. This revolves around a publication by a young postdoc, Michael Mann, with 2 senior colleagues together, senior paleoclimate scientists, in Geophysical Research Letters in 1999, which was the first reconstruction of the northern hemisphere temperature for the last millennium, and it shows that, you know, how unusual that modern temperature rise is. And at first it went unnoticed for a couple of years, but it turned up then in the 3rd IPCC report a few years later, in I think it was 2001, and it was then, because the curve then became prominent, it became a major focus of attacks on the credibility of the scientists. A massive campaign against this started, court cases, threats. At the height of the anthrax scare, an envelope with a white powder was sent to Michael Mann, which made the police evacuate the university building, for example, where he worked. And unfortunately, quite a few media took up that climate skeptic narrative from the fossil fuel lobby and declared this curve as wrong or even fraudulent. I just give you one example. I have a couple of examples also from the German media, because that's where I live and work. This is one from a conservative newspaper, Die Welt, which basically said that the hockey stick has been corrected. It was wrong, and it said that a demolished hockey stick keeps climate researchers on their toes. But there are a few problems with that narrative. This is a supposed correction of the hockey stick curve, which claims that in the 14th, 15th century it was already once as warm as in the modern time. But the problem is that this supposed correction didn't come from any paleoclimatologist, but it came from Steve McIntyre, who has been working until then for 30 years in the mining industry, and Ross McKittrick. He was a neoliberal economist at a think tank, and this curve was never published in the reputable scientific literature. A particular kind of deceptive aspect of this article is that it kind of presents the case as if this correction, supposed correction of the hockey stick curve, resulted from a correction that Mann and colleagues published in Nature magazine, even though this corrigendum that they published explicitly stated that it changes absolutely nothing about the curve. It was just correcting the supplementary information with all the list of data series that had gone into constructing this curve. That journalist, Axel Bojanowski, has gone on to this day to lift climate skeptics' narratives into mainstream German media, and thereby giving them some kind of credibility, which in the scientific community they simply do not have. But there were, even in the scientific literature, some baseless attacks on the Mann et al. Hockey stick curve. For example, this was probably the most prominent example by Willy Soon and Sally Berliunas in climate research. It actually led then to the whole editors of that journal stepping down, because they had published this dubious article. It was a review, no original research, but the scientists that had conducted and published the original research protested against kind of distortion of their results in this paper. The paper was funded with $53,000 by the American Petroleum Institute, and it later was also found that Willy Soon had received over $1 million in funding from fossil fuel companies, including Exxon, and he had kept this secret. He didn't disclose his conflict of interest with papers that he published in journals where you have to disclose such a conflict of interest. Now, just 2 decades later, with big paleoclimate projects collecting data from around the world, we know a lot more about the evolution. We now have a kind of hockey stick curve, which I showed in a different color version earlier on, for the last 2,000 years. So the hockey stick has now been extended from 1,000 to 2,000, and it covers the globe and not just the northern hemisphere as the original 1999 study. And the observed temperature has gone even higher, and the uncertainty range around that curve is now also smaller than in the original Mann et al. Curve. But if you put the Mann et al. Curve from 1999 on top of this, it basically sits exactly on top of the modern knowledge. So the authors of this study have received numerous prizes, are highly regarded in the scientific community, but basically for decades it has been almost like a membership card of the climate skeptics community to claim that there's something wrong with Mike Mann's hockey stick. Michael Mann actually wrote a great book about this called The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars. And for those who read German, I also on my blog have a kind of short summary of this whole debate with further references. So let's go on to some other examples, concrete examples, because I've been working in paleoclimate myself since the 1990s, so that's why I like showing paleoclimate examples, but also it simply is one of the most common climate skeptic arguments to say, but climate has always changed. You know, you've probably all heard this argument. And a lot of fake curves circulate in the social media about this. That particular one, you know, I saw it again last week. It's been there for decades. It's actually originally from a German colleague, Dietrich Schönwiese, whom I know well, who published this in a textbook nearly 30 years ago when there wasn't much in terms of paleoclimate data. And it's a hand-drawn curve, but it's based on the fact, it's based on the Camp Century ice core in Greenland. That was the first one, drilled from 1963 to 1966. And this curve only tells you, of course, about the local temperature in northern Greenland at the site of this ice core. And the data end before global warming really took off. So the claim here on the left here, it says average northern hemisphere temperature and goes from whatever 11 to 17 degrees Celsius. That's complete bullshit. The real data, they are of course sub-zero temperatures because we're in northern Greenland. This is a fake legend there put on the y-axis, and also this thing here at the end that this is supposedly the anthropogenic global warming hysteria. That is also complete bullshit. Also, this predicted mini ice age is also bullshit. It's not in the original Schönwiese curve. There are many versions in German, in English, and other languages, and it comes up again and again on Twitter, for example. It's just one of these examples of a kind of denial narrative, which I always tend to say that this kind of lies just illustrate that the denial community has no honest arguments. They simply don't. So they come up with complete nonsense like this. Now here's another example. This actually is from this year, also seen on Twitter. Steve Milloy, this is a fossil fuel lobbyist, who here claims that global cooling, you know, the last 8 years, global cooling despite massive CO2 emissions. And you know, the disturbing thing is down here. 13.4 million people have seen this tweet. I have never achieved even above 1 million, even though I'm one of the 5 Twitter climate scientists with the most followers there. The deniers, the fossil fuel lobby, gets much more bandwidth, basically, with this kind of bullshit. There's a very nice animation of the global temperatures since the 1970s, and it basically consists of a lot of global cooling episodes, right? So basically, after every big El Nino event, you get 7, 8, or even 10 years of global cooling, etc. So we have known this, you know, people who've been in this business for a few decades. You know, we have repeatedly seen this global cooling claims after every new record in the global temperature. There are a few years where that it takes until the next record is being broken because there's natural variability superimposed on the global temperature. So skeptical science, I will recommend them again later on. They do a very good job at systematically debunking this kind of nonsense, but it still has huge bandwidth. It's a typical example of cherry picking. Another example in my own research field of sea level rise, where I also have done quite a bit of work, is Björn Lomborg. He's a very successful climate skeptic, has been for decades writing bestsellers on this, lots of editorials by him published around the world in the media. And one of them was in The Guardian in 2008, where he wrote that over the past 2 years, really long period, sea levels have not increased at all. Actually, they show a slight drop. Should we not be told that this is much better than expected? I like that wording because it's a typical insinuation that climate scientists are telling you lies. You know, they're not telling you that sea level is really dropping and it's much better than expected. What I also really liked about this article is the title. It said, "Let the data speak for itself," and he didn't show the data. So I published a comment in The Guardian showing the data. And when he published his article, this brief pause in sea level rise was already over anyway. If he had taken the most current data, anyone could have seen that already. But if you just look at the background, you know that there is natural variability, like in all geophysical time series. Now, he's earning a lot of money with this kind of climate denial. Who wouldn't want an annual salary of $775,000? And that is just from his work for one think tank and not just even the income of his bestsellers and so on. I wrote a commentary on Björn Lomborg on our Real Climate blog, which, if you want to read more on him. I asked the question, is he just a scientist with a different opinion? Spoiler, no, he has never published anything of substance in the scientific literature. So, in fact, the sea level rise is not only continuing, it is accelerating. And now if you look at the really long-term curve, you see that little blip that Lomborg used to claim that sea level is dropping. It's hardly visible, really, in the data. It's just one of these tiny fluctuations. Now, actually, the denial of sea level rise is a whole subcategory of climate denial. And there was a nice article once by some American sea level expert colleagues about denying sea level rise. That was especially about debates in North Carolina. I was myself in North Carolina doing some field work there, drilling sediment cores on the coast of North Carolina. And we also did a stakeholder dialogue. You actually see me in this comic here. This is supposed to be me. So this is a comic actually put out by the German Advisory Council on Global Change, which is a government-appointed body that I was a member of for 8 years. And we published serious reports, of course, but one of them about the great transformation to a sustainable global society also came out in the form of a comic book. So if you're thinking about science communication, there's also one option. And we held this while we were doing the field work there on the sandy coast of North Carolina. We also held a stakeholder workshop. And it was very interesting to me to see that there, the big stakeholders that deny sea level rise, it's not actually the fossil fuel lobby, but it was the real estate lobby, because of course the real estate, they're really expensive houses there right on the coastline. It's a beautiful coastline, but they are kind of gradually eroding away and falling into the ocean. And of course, it really devalues the real estate at the waterfront, and the real estate lobby didn't want to hear that. This actually went even as far as in neighboring Virginia. A lawmaker said that sea level rise is a left-wing term and can't be used in official government reports. So this is the most bizarre thing, that just a factual thing like sea level rise is considered politically charged and a left-wing term. Yeah. I don't believe in global warming. This is, but what's this sprayer artist? I just can't remember the name now. Banksy, exactly, Banksy. This is a Banksy piece of art here. With that, I come to a kind of next little subchapter, the kind of common characteristics of climate science denial. And there is this nice Flick model developed by John Cook and others. Fake experts is the first point here. We often see these fake experts on television that in reality are fossil fuel lobbyists posing as climate experts. And I just this morning going through Twitter. It's a bad habit to look at Twitter when I wake up first thing in the morning, I have to say. I saw my NASA colleague, Gavin Schmidt. He has a whole thread about debating these fake experts, contrarians on television. The conclusion basically that he draws is that it's not worth it. And I have for decades not debated climate deniers on TV or radio. So, I would in writing, because it's a different matter, but in a live debate, basically, it just promotes the idea that people come away with the idea that the experts disagree, that there are two sides to this and people can't decide who's right, which completely confuses them about the fact that there actually is a consensus. And so my approach is, when I get asked by some radio show or so to debate a climate denier, I say, okay, I'm ready to debate everyone as long as they have a reasonable publication record on this topic in the peer-reviewed literature. And then these radio or TV people go and look and realize, oops, this guy has never done any climate research. And I have several times had the success that they dropped this whole approach of having a debate with a denier in the first place and just invited me for an interview or so, because they realize that the other person was a fake expert and not a real expert. As a counterexample, that's already quite a few years ago, maybe 15 or so. There was once a famous, well-known German TV talk show, and they invited our director, then John Schellenhuber, and then a few days before the show, they rang up our press department and asked, don't you know anyone who denies all this? We don't find anyone. And so they really wanted to get somebody just to have a controversial debate about whether there is anthropogenic climate change or not. And in the end, there was somebody in this program who had never published anything in the international peer-reviewed literature, but was claiming climate change is due to solar activity. Actually, somebody from Berlin. Second point here, logical fallacies. A classic one is, say, climate has always changed, so humans can't be the cause of this climate change. This is obviously not logical. Impossible expectations is people demanding an experimental proof that the observed global warming is really due to human activities. That's obviously not something that science can deliver, some kind of mathematical proof. We can only deliver overwhelming evidence in favor for this. Cherry picking, I already showed you one example, or two examples actually, with Milloy and Lomborg. And then there are conspiracy theories, because of course if you are trying to say that all climate scientists are wrong, and there are, many thousands of climate scientists around the world, if you add them all up, you have to come up with some explanation why would they do this, some conspiracy theory. Just think of what a fantastic movie plot this would be. Thousands of climate scientists conspire to deceive the whole world, but only a few fossil fuel bosses see through this plot. This is a fantastic movie idea. So without some kind of conspiracy, you can't explain what's going on. There is a very nice poster. This is by Skeptical Science, led by John Cook, and also a German sister website, Klimafakten. They have put this nice poster explaining these 5 methods of scientific denialism. You have a question?
Yeah. So people on the climate denial side will level some of these same allegations at the anthropogenic climate change camp that you guys start the baselines at the very end of the last medieval ice age, or you're saying a lot of these people are funded by big oil, big coal. A lot of those people will also say, well, there's tons of money in the green movement and the environmental lobby. When thinking about how to counter that perspective, do you actually go point by point? Because otherwise it seems like you're giving credence to like the false equivalency between the two sides, but there are some like legitimate, well, people think that they're legitimate criticisms. They get out of climate science. There are also be some amount of cherry picking. So how do you think about combating those narratives?
Well, I mean, I can say the website skepticalscience.com has a kind of encyclopedic collection of all the denier arguments, and you will find the counter arguments to these points there. To be very brief, I mean, ending of the little ice age is not a physical mechanism that will cause unprecedented warming, and we show the data as far as we have, and I showed you them going back way before the last little ice age, namely more than 20,000 years back. And the big, the fossil fuel industry is one of the biggest industries on the planet, and they make huge profits compared to which the entire climate science effort is pocket money, and there is not big funding in promoting a false climate change narrative. The big money is always in the industries of the past, the status quo, which are trying to suppress the fledgling new things. The renewable industry is now getting bigger, obviously, but it, for the last decades, has been very, very tiny in comparison. Anyway, I won't want to get into this. I want to continue with a nice, well, not nice, example of conspiracy theories. Maybe the most egregious example of conspiracy theory is that climate scientists are planning a global genocide. Yeah, that's true. Some people promote this, and for a while, this LaRouche movement was pretty big on this. They were out there with banners protesting quite a few of my talks that I have given. And here's one at the Nobel laureate meeting in Stockholm that we were actually from the Potsdam Institute involved in organizing. I talked to these guys that were standing outside here. Schellenhuber's our director from the Potsdam Institute at the time. These guys kind of handed out leaflets saying we're planning the global genocide, and I talked to them, and they were actually flown in from Berlin by that LaRouche movement to come to Stockholm and stand there and protest. Totally bizarre. So useful resources to counter misinformation. This is just a very short list because this debate has been going on for quite a few decades now. There are a lot of really good resources. I already mentioned the skepticalscience.com and klimafakten.de, which kind of systematically devoted to countering misinformation. Blogs like our own Real Climate blog, which was ranked by Nature magazine as one of the top science blogs of the world. Then there's a debunking handbook and uncertainty handbook by Steve Lewandowski, who is sitting back there. Hi, Steve. So then there's a handbook in German to how to talk about climate, because if you have relatives or so, for example, or colleagues, this is a difficult issue, how to talk to those that are really stuck with these climate denial narratives. And in case you get into legal trouble, there is a climate science legal defense fund in the United States, because some colleagues there have been the subject of court cases. I have been myself, actually, here in Germany for a blog article that I wrote. And so it's good to have some support in some cases. I want to move on to who is actually funding all this climate denial. And here's one example. The company Exxon has been publishing for many, many years so-called advertorials. These are things that look, in major US newspapers like New York Times. They look like editorials, but in the small print you can see that they're actually paid for by Exxon. I don't actually think this kind of thing exists in Germany. It's quite, I mean, an editorial is, I don't know how it's not somehow corruption, actually. It's weird. And it's totally fake arguments. This one is just an example that I picked out because this argument has been used by our right-wing German AfD party in the election campaign, saying that only 3 to 4% of the CO2 emissions come from human activities and the rest is coming from nature. That, of course, is a total deception because it basically compares a closed cycle with added carbon dioxide. You know, what nature does is in the summer, there's a lot of photosynthesis taking up CO2, and then in the winter when there's little photosynthesis and biomass rots, etc., it gets released again. It's a closed cycle. I mean, the release of CO2 in nature from rotting biomass can only release CO2 that was taken up out of the atmosphere beforehand. So it can never actually increase the CO2 unless you have a mass die-off of forests, of course. And that's also the reason why, you know, throughout the Holocene, the CO2 concentration was practically constant because the natural cycles are cycles. But what we are doing now is adding CO2 to the atmosphere, and even if that's only at a rate of 3 to 4%, if you compare it to that turnover in the cycle, it's still 100% of the reason why CO2 is increasing. So we have actually increased CO2 by 50% over what it was until about 150 years ago, and that's 100% human activity. So this is just simply a deception. Basically, any person in a company should recognize it, that it kind of compares turnover to a net profit, and that's not very reasonable. Now, there's a lot of money behind this, not only by Exxon. There was a relatively recent article in Forbes showing that just in a single year, these 5 big oil companies had spent more than $200 million on anti-climate science lobbying and lobbying against climate mitigation measures. This is really a big amount of money. And then a lot of that goes into foundations where you can't even really sometimes track where the money is coming from. For example, this network of think tanks like the Frontiers of Freedom Foundation or the Heartland Institute, Global Warming Policy Foundation in Great Britain. They were basically the same people that drove the Brexit campaign. And the Heartland Institute even had a billboard campaign next to motorways with these billboards showing the convicted terrorist Ted Kaczynski saying, "I still believe in global warming, do you?" I mean, that was so over the top that they actually lost funding from quite a few donors from industry over that, because that kind of was too embarrassing even for them. Now, getting back to Exxon, the fossil industry knew exactly what it was doing. This is an Exxon projection of climate change due to CO2 rise, climate change and CO2 rise actually, from 1982, from internal Exxon documents that were turned up by a journalistic research and made public. And you can see here on the left, it's a CO2 curve, and the right is a temperature curve with a scale on the right. And the red lines show what really has happened until now. It is pretty much exactly what Exxon predicted in 1982. They even predicted slightly faster CO2 rise and slightly more warming than actually happened. And also really interesting, in 1977, an Exxon scientist, James Black, presented this to the company CEOs. This is a temperature curve over the last full glacial cycle. So here you have this last interglacial, the Eemian that I mentioned 120,000 years ago, maybe slightly warmer than the Holocene. The Holocene here is the end. Here, that's our Holocene. And you go slowly into the Ice Age with these cycles that come from the precession cycle of the Earth orbit, a 23,000 year cycle superimposed on that. That's these waves. And The red line is when we force our climate model in my department with these Milankovitch cycles that Milutin Milankovitch discovered in the 1920s. If you drive the climate models with that, we basically reproduce the ice age cycles, even going back 3 million years. We reproduce all the ice ages with the climate model. And it pretty well agrees with what Exxon knew at the time. And the interesting point here is that this Exxon scientist predicted a carbon dioxide-induced super interglacial, so warmer than normal interglacials like this last interglacial here. And the black curve went up to here. This is actually a 2-degree warming scenario that we added there for anthropogenic warming in our model simulation, added to the Milankovitch cycles. And this scientist was only wrong on one count, namely that he thought that the black curve goes back down again there. So after about 5,000 years, global warming would be over. And only later, he couldn't know better at the time, only later it was understood that the CO2 remains in the atmosphere much longer. It remains elevated for hundreds of thousands of years. That's the kind of long tail of global warming that we are causing because of the very long residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And actually we are, in my department, we have research projects funded by both the Swiss and the German nuclear power authorities to predict the coming ice ages up to 1 million years ahead of time, because of course you can calculate these orbital cycles with astronomical precision millions of years back and into the future. Milankovitch did this with pencil and paper when he was in prison at the time. Nowadays we can do that. He was in prison not because he had committed a crime, but because he had the wrong politics. And you need to know when the Earth will be dug up by big ice sheets again if you build a nuclear waste storage site. And that's why we get the funding to predict the next ice ages with the climate model. And it turns out that we already have elevated the CO2 enough now to prevent the next ice age, which would have started in 50,000 years. And if we continue emitting, we will cancel more and more ice ages up to 1 million years into the future. Now back to Exxon, we recently this year published a paper in Science looking systematically at the projections, quantitative projection curves found in these internal Exxon documents. This was done together with Jeffrey Supran and Naomi Oreskes from Harvard University. They are science historians, and all these black lines and gray lines are projections from Exxon, mostly done by Exxon scientists themselves, in some cases ones that they took from the academic community and put into internal reports. And the lighter the gray, the earlier this projection starts. So the black ones are the last ones. You see the very earliest from the 1970s, that goes up here, that overestimated the global warming. From the 1980s onwards, they were all in the right magnitudes here compared to what then actually happened in terms of global warming. And if you compute a skill score of these Exxon projections, they're actually just slightly better than those coming out of the academic research community. And of course, not a single one projects much less global warming or even no global warming. But of course, the latter is exactly what the Exxon decided to tell the general public in all these advertorials, that the science was really uncertain and we didn't know whether it would cause any global warming. They really knew better. Even quantitatively, they knew exactly what was coming. And our UN General Secretary Guterres was in the World Economic Forum in Davos. That was about a week after our paper appeared in Science, and he said that we learned last week that certain fossil fuel producers were fully aware in the 1970s that their core product was baking our planet, just like the tobacco industry They rode roughshod over their own science. Big oil peddled the big lie, and like the tobacco industry, those responsible must be held to account. I fully agree with that, and there is quite a few court cases ongoing now against Exxon and other fossil fuel companies. Different approaches trying to get them to fund climate protection measures like flood protection, trying to force them, like a case against VW in Germany, to actually in the future reduce their emissions. And I think also court cases for deceiving the shareholders, for example, by not openly communicating the risks to their industry. So there is a whole doubt industry, and I always like this Guardian headline: doubt over climate science is a product with an industry behind it. That really sums it up, and it has been very effective, this product. Actually, there is a famous also internal memo from a PR advisor which says doubt is our product. And so the whole attempt by the fossil fuel industry has just been to sell doubt to the public, and they have really delayed the climate protection measures, and they have brought us into this conundrum that we're basically stuck in now. So it's a very, very tough decision here: prioritize profits of big oil CEOs or back the Green New Deal. It's a nice cartoon. Well, tough. What shall we do? One reason why this is such a debate is also, I see a big role of the media there. False balance, rich owners is what I call this. And here's a nice cartoon by John Cook. This scenario, of course, we have all seen over and over again on television. Already Stephen Schneider, decades ago, one of the real pioneers of climate communication, used to say that this climate denial on TV is like if every time there was a report on television about a satellite launch, they would invite someone from the Flat Earth Society to give a different perspective. And of course, there's also academic literature about this balance as bias idea, the false balance. And this study, for example, concludes that the US prestige press, this is not Fox News, this is the prestige press coverage of global warming from 1988 to 2002 has contributed to significant divergence of popular discourse from scientific discourse. That also really sums it up nicely. What we debate at scientific conferences has basically nothing to do with the popular debate about climate science. And that's why the people out there, they don't know that there has been a scientific consensus on human-caused global warming for decades now. There are some old studies that starts here, 2009, the top left, which found that there's a 97% consensus amongst climate scientists. There are more recent studies in the lower panel here going up to 2021. It's always more than 97%. I would say from my personal experience going to conferences, it's definitely more than 99% of climate scientists that agree with the consensus on human-caused global warming. For at least 10, 15 years, I have not seen somebody at a scientific climate conference claim there is some doubt about this being caused by human activities. But the public doesn't know that. In the past or in the US, the public typically thinks that there's kind of half and half split amongst climate scientists on this topic. Even in Europe, even as recently as last year, the people still think that maybe 30-35% of climate scientists disagree on human-caused global warming, which is just completely wrong. So there's a completely false perception. That's why it's called balance as bias. The public is completely wrong about this because the media are constantly showing fake debates on this topic. Here's another prime example. I'm just looking at the clock. I have to speed up a little bit, but prime example very successful television film, The Great Global Warming Swindle. It had one of these fake paleoclimate curves. It said now where it actually ends before global warming started. It showed this correlation between solar activity and temperature. Now temperature in blue. Now if you actually extended the data to the time where this TV program appeared, oops, they have really, since the 1980s, they have really separated. You know, solar activity has gone down, temperature has gone up. The filmmaker said this is a controversial, or I think it was the television channel who said that it's a controversial film, but we feel that it is important that all sides of the debate are aired. It's again this idea, give equal time to the flat earthers. And the filmmaker, he was confronted on Australian TV live about why he left out these data. And he just said, oh, well, you know, I wanted to show the state of knowledge at the time, you know, in the past. Total nonsense. In Germany, we also have this fake debate, even covers of big news magazines. Forscherstreit means debate among scientists. And so when you read the actual article, whether there is no climate disaster because there will perhaps be a cold time because of the declining solar activity, the sources of that so-called controversy was some Siberian scientists that nobody in our science community has ever heard of. Then the science organization, that's what they said, Friends of Science. Now, if you hear an organization with the name Friends of Science, you should be immediately very suspicious. And in fact, it is an astroturfing group funded by the Canadian fossil fuel industry. And then they cited the European Institute for Climate and Energy, as if this was a European Institute for Climate and Energy and not a group of pensioners with a climate denialist website. Which I think is the role of the media to disclose, you know, what is this group that calls itself European Institute for Climate and Energy, but in an interview once said we don't need climate scientists. So we also have a very prominent CEO of RWE, which is the largest CO2 emitter in Europe, German power company, mainly coal, who claimed it's the sun stupid. It's a quote from him. He wrote a whole book called, nicely actually, the nice title, The Cold Sun. Then you scratch your head and you have a problem. How do you put this together, that there's a cold sun but global warming? And the answer is, of course, global warming is global cooling is just ahead. It's just around the corner. And he even published a quantitative prediction curve in this book. It's the climate projection that is being falsified the fastest from all the ones I've ever seen. But he's still popular in the media and gives a lot of talks. Okay, still on the media topic, Wall Street Journal, there was a nice analysis of how many editorials and how many columns over a long time stretch here, more than 10 years, have mentioned the fact that climate change has actually something to do with fossil fuels. Almost none, as you can see. Why is that so? It's because Wall Street Journal belongs to Rupert Murdoch's media empire, which is probably the biggest perpetrator of climate misinformation over the last decades around the world. They own Fox News in Britain, the tabloid The Sun, The Times, the British TV satellite channel B-Sky B. Most of the Australian media are in the hands of Rupert Murdoch's media empire. And that's why after these horrendous fires in Australia, they published this article, Warming is Good for Us, which complains about climate activists instrumentalizing the horrible fires for their cause. This is also quite typical that whenever, as a climate scientist or activist, after an extreme weather event or so, you say, we need to do something about global warming, you're instrumentalizing the horrible victims of these extreme event for your political purposes. Just recently, another one from The Sun in Britain claims that there's a breakneck race to net zero. I mean, whose fault is it that we have to reduce emissions really fast to net zero now? It's the fault of those media themselves and the fossil fuel industry who have delayed action. If we had started reducing emissions after the Rio summit with the United Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, we could have reduced emissions at a very leisurely pace, but now we have to hit the brakes full on. Now, in the meantime, that's my last point, actually almost last point. The debate has shifted, as was predicted more than a decade ago in this old cartoon. We're actually now at 415 parts per million or so already. And the debate has now actually shifted away, at least in Europe, maybe not in the US, from denying climate change to discourses of delay, basically trying to delay, acknowledging we have to protect the climate, but trying to delay it. And in Germany, certainly, and also in Britain, I know there's a lot of fake news about solutions, about wind, solar, electric cars that are supposedly worse than combustion engine cars for the environment, about batteries, about heat pumps. We have a huge heat pump debate in Germany with incredible amounts of fake news about heat pumps, and a huge campaign of the tabloid Bild against our climate and economics minister from the Green Party, Habeck. These are just some examples of it's the heating hammer by Habeck, where he supposedly goes into your cellar and rips out your oil heater, even though the proposed legislation just said that any new heating systems installed from next year should be at least getting 65% of their heating energy from renewable sources. It doesn't require you to use a heat pump for that. Now, the boss of that publisher who publishes Bild tabloid has in leaked internal communication said he really likes global warming. Actually, he doesn't think one should do anything against it. It's nice to have a warmer climate. And 48% or 48.5% of that publisher, Springer, is owned by the US private equity firm KKR, which is heavily invested in fossil fuels. So it's not surprising that they do this. There's a very nice also cartoon site which summarizes all these discourses of delay that just try to delay the necessary climate action. I just give a couple of examples here. This is the whataboutism, what about China? You've all heard this. Individualism. So it's you as individual consumers with your CO2 footprint, you are to blame, you have to change, not politics and industry. Or no sticks, just carrots. This is the favorite argument also in German politics. There shouldn't be a law requiring 65% renewables. We should just incentivize with money, but then the finance minister says, oh, well, sorry, we don't have the money. And then these appeals to social justice by people that have never cared about social justice, but when it is convenient to delay climate action by saying, well, that poor nurse having to get by car to her job, she has to have her combustion engine with cheap petrol, etc. These are all standard tactics, which probably you have all seen. So finally, what should we do? We have the Paris Accord, that is great. I want to just highlight the point that all countries have bindingly agreed to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees for good reasons. Even Saudi Arabia, Russia have all agreed to this for very good reasons. What does it mean? You have to know that CO2 accumulates because of the long lifetime in the atmosphere, which I've already mentioned. So the cumulative emissions is what counts. And if you want to keep the cumulative emissions low, it doesn't really matter when you're climate neutral. but the area under these curves matters. This is from the latest IPCC report. We have to go onto this blue path with halving the global emissions by 2030. That's in 7 years' time, if we want to have a good chance to limit the warming to 1.5. And so this very steep immediate decline is critical here. And then you have kind of a longer tail where you have some way to deal with emissions that are very hard to get rid of, like those from agriculture. But the big, fossil electricity generation and fossil transport, we have to get rid of really as fast as we can, due to the guys who have delayed all this. We have the next climate summit coming up again in November. The COP is a conference of the parties. This is the 28th one. Their annual conferences of the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the one that was agreed in Rio '92. And this one is headed by an oil industry CEO, Sultan Al Jaber from United Arab Emirates. And they have already launched a major astroturfing campaign on Twitter, for example, with all these fake accounts. These are artificial intelligence generated faces. They are not real people praising the environmental record of United Arab Emirates there. So to conclude, the IPCC says there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. This is a statement with very high confidence. And the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. A statement with high confidence because we know about the long lifetime of CO2. Now, what I've tried to tell you is that global warming has been documented for decades. It threatens the continuation of civilization, peaceful living together as we know it. And politicians and society at large are still delaying the solutions to these problems, even though we have the solutions, the technological ones. We just need to roll them out really fast. And a massive lobbying campaign and astonishing media failure are not the least contributing factors to that. And with that, I thank you very much if you want to read more. And now I'm here for discussion, and sorry for running over time a little bit. Thank you.